our native land, our native land, our native, our native, our native land. Hoya, hoya, our native land.
Hey everybody, Tchadas here, host of Our Native Land through Czech Podcast Studios in Victoria, British Columbia. Before we start with the interview, I'm just going to do a territory acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory Czech Studio stands upon, and to all the Indigenous tribes that are part of the New Channel, Kwakwakak, and Coast Salish on Vancouver Island. I thank these nations and traditional land keepers for allowing us to live, work, and play on their lands. And I thank you, the listener and viewer, for tuning in to another episode of Our Native Land. I'm Tchadas, your host, and today we're going to be talking to two guests from Indiginews. Emily Gilpin is the first one, and she is Cree, Métis, Filipina, Scottish, and Irish, currently living on the Saanich territories on Vancouver Island. She's currently the managing editor for the Indiginews, an online news Indigenous news outlet dedicated to covering the news in a way that allows for Indigenous stories to be heard, understood, and respected. Emily and Indiginews claims to produce valuable, relevant, and trustworthy content by listening to the communities they serve through their work. My second guest is Anna McKenzie, and Anna McKenzie is the child welfare reporter for the Indiginews website and is a member of the Opaskwayak First Nation and currently lives on the unceded homeland of the Nanaimo First Nation. Anna's background is in the Indigenous child, youth, and community engagement. She has a Bachelor of Arts in First Nation and Indigenous Studies from the University of British Columbia and is an experienced writer and researcher. Her passion is upholding the stories and lived experiences of Indigenous children and youth. Emily and Anna, welcome to Our Native Land.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Okay, we are going to start with Emily. Emily, let's talk about the origins of Indiginews, how it came to be. I understand there's some partnerships or funding backed through the discourse and APTN. So let's dive right into it.
Sure. So in 2018, the federal government announced that they were going to support independent journalism in Canada. So that they dedicated 60 million over, I think it was for 5 years. And that money went to something called Heritage Canada. And then from Heritage Canada, there was an initiative called the Local Journalism Initiative. And so, of course, within the media world, word spread that this funding was going to be available, who was going to be eligible, who was going to get a chunk of it. So at that time, I was told that Aaron Miller, who's the CEO of Discourse, and Karen Pugliese, who at the time was with APTN, met up and chatted and said, you know what, we should really get on top of this and, use some of this funds to support more independent media. I don't know if it was their intention for it to be like a women-led or non-male-led kind of media company, but they started having chats. And from there, Aaron spoke with Lindsay Sample, who's on mat leave right now. She was the former executive manager of Indiginews. And Lindsay got a hold of me. I was living in Brazil at the time. I was in Brazil last year, and I was always talking around about decolonizing media and how, media needs to do a better job. So she took me on as an advisor on the project early on. And when I moved back to Canada, I joined the team. But they did apply for Local Journalism Initiative funding for a number of different applications, contracts. Some applications were denied, some weren't, and they're very specific. So we applied for positions under child welfare, education, and health within the Okanagan and across Vancouver Island. These topics were considered news deserts, underreported, underrepresented. So that's how the reporters are funded. And then my role comes from another initiative. And so an In Spirit Foundation initiative funding. So yeah, we got started, kind of kicked off May last year with 3 reporters in the Okanagan, hired 4 more reporters in August. Another reporter kind of left after December, which was, all in good terms and everything, but we've been going from there. And if anyone knows anything about LJI, like Local Journalism Initiative, and how independent media, like the hustle in so-called Canada to really make independent media happen, I'm sure you folks do on your end.
Yeah,
too.
Of course. Yeah.
But it's been a bit of a challenge, right? Because we haven't heard back on whether those applications are renewed. And I find it quite ironic that like the reporters have these very strict restrictions on, you should be reporting 2 to 4 stories a week, and it should look like this for you to be able to get this funding to do your work. And then meanwhile, there seems to be no kind of expectation of deadlines for these folks. And so LJI is comprised of a panel of so-called media experts. And I encourage folks to look into who that panel is, maybe check in on the diversity of that panel, who's making the decisions on who gets the funding and that sort of thing. But that's where we are now. And, you know, we've just been working pretty hard, hustling to get out some stories. Like I said, our ethic is unlike anything I've ever seen, any newsroom I've ever been a part of. We really do practice relationship-based reporting. We have a really high standard for the care and accuracy because we're working with families and children, and you know, we're entering into a field that we know has been historically misrepresented and ignored. So yeah, that's kind of where things are right now with Indiginews.
Fantastic. And is Indiginews just an online content based right now, right?
Yes, that's right. And I should have said, sorry. So once they did secure that funding, Indiginews is considered like a branch of Discourse Media. So Discourse would be the employer and backed by APTN. So we do have a relationship with APTN. They do share most of our stories. But because our reporters are LJI funded through LJI licensing, a number of different outlets can republish our stories. But yeah, right now we're online content and we're kind of considered like a branch of Discourse Media at this point. That's
fantastic. Well, I'm excited. It sounds like it's constantly developing and changing, and I think you guys are doing a great job. I personally follow you guys, and I love reading all your articles. So thank you so much. Let's hop over to Anna. Anna, talk to me a bit about how you got involved with Indiginews and kind of what fuels your passion to report.
Sure. So I was just coming off of 1 year's maternity leave and was looking to see, you know, how did I want to re-enter the world? You know, in the middle of my maternity leave, the pandemic hit. So everybody was working from home, and Emily and I have known each other for a number of years. We're actually related. And
there you go.
When Emily moved to Vancouver, we had a coffee and we got to know each other. We've just kept in touch ever since. And I had seen the job posting for Indiginews for the child welfare reporter, and I was like, wow, that is like my dream job. If I hadn't gone to do a BA, I would have gone to journalism school. And there was always this, you know, this little voice in the back of my head saying, you know, you could have done it, and it's too late now. Like, you know, in your 30s, you have a baby. And anyways, Emily reached out to me and was like, I think you would be great for this role. Would you be interested in interviewing for the position? And I did the interview while Emily was in Brazil, and then over the phone with Lindsay Sample as well. And I was on a hike with all three of my children, and had this like 45-minute conversation. And even in that interview, it just kind of made sense to me that all of the steps that I've taken up until this point in my career and in my life have sort of led me to this work. And it's very serendipitous in that way. And connecting with my colleagues, we're all sort of, we all feel the same way, that this moment in time sort of just landed within us and it brought us all together in a good way to tell these stories.
I find with COVID, especially for myself, even I think it gives everybody a moment to stop, rethink, and what am I going to do, and how am I going to re-enter this world, especially during the pandemic. So congratulations on the job, that's for sure. Let's talk a little bit with Emily again, and I want to know the importance of why, you know, Indiginews is run by an all-woman Indigenous staff. You said you're not sure if it was intentional or not, but tell me how that path has shaped the news outlet.
Oh, it's been amazing. And I'll clarify, at first we weren't all women, we were all women and non-gender conforming folks. So very gender diverse group, but just happened to not have anyone on the team that identified as male. So that was the first for me anyways. And, you know, we had a lot of these ideas around, you know what, like a workplace doesn't need to be exploitative and exhausting, and you know that a place that we can only show up as our part selves. Like, I think we all really came with the intention, like, can we actually have like a healthy work environment? Can we support each other? Can we come as our full selves, all the different hats that we wear, the different relationships that we maintain? And so that's been really amazing. You know, we have bi-weekly meetings and we check in on how was your weekend, you know, and sometimes it's like, oh, I was in ceremony, I was out on the land, or I was with my family. We hold space for each other when we're in mourning and grieving and going through difficult processes. And that's been really incredible. So I think just the standard, like the culture within our newsroom is very different than you would think of like a mainstream newsroom, because I've been in those newsrooms before, even just interning or just visiting or, that sort of thing. And it's like, I remember one time I was working as an intern in CBC Montreal for a radio show, and I was just sitting there and someone was like, I need a Syrian refugee, and like, I need someone that's going to cry. And I was like, yo, man, I don't know if I can do this. Like, I'm like heart first kind of person, right? And those are my teachings, those are my values. So I was like, is this the culture of news everywhere? And that's why even in journalism school, I did a 10-month program at Concordia. I was like giving workshops on decolonizing, because I was like, okay, there's a lot of this that is good, but also journalism and storytelling, as we know, it's an ancient practice. It doesn't need to come with this capitalistic, patriarchal, exploitative kind of colonial culture and mindset. So I think we've been putting a lot of that into practice. It's been pretty amazing team to be a part of. People care about the stories that they're writing. They care about the people. They care about the issues, right? We're connected to them. So it's very different. It's not like, oh, let's get the story to get the headline, to get the Pulitzer Prize, to get the money, to whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool that way.
Do you feel like you have a certain amount of freedom because you're not a traditional news outlet? Like, do you feel like the effect of you doing the stories you're doing and the way you're doing them, do you feel like you are being heard when it comes to decolonizing a lot of news stories in the media right now?
Yeah, I mean, Anna can say too, like, I think we're still pretty restricted to a certain extent, just because, again, like we have this funding that comes from this application that has very specific mandates. So we're still fitting under that mandate of we have to report under these 3 categories. So a conversation we have often is like, is this an education story? And then of course you have to say, well, what's education, right? Like, this is an education story if you're looking at it in terms of like Indigenous knowledge systems. But in terms of the way that, kind of the colonial government or colonial minds think about education, it's like, well, we should be really reporting on like these institutions and these, government bodies. And so we've been playing with that a little bit, but we definitely are still restricted in some ways. But I think we've also, we are a team of emerging journalists as well. So we've been doing a lot of training, like at the same time, and a lot of like just experimenting on how we can do that kind of thing. But I mean, I think if you look through our content and even just visually, like if you just scroll our Instagram page or scroll Indiginews, it's like, and when we say representation matters, it's real. Like sometimes I'll just look back, because we're always working, right? We don't always have as much time to look back, but I'll look back and look at all of these diverse faces, a lot of women, a lot of like gender diverse folks, a lot of children. And I'm like, wow, we really are we're carving out a space in the media content, whether folks are totally tuned into it or not, it's happening. And so it's pretty cool to see.
That's really cool. I'm glad it's always nice to look back to, and then you can really see what accomplishments you're doing. And I think it fuels people to move forward too, right?
Yeah.
Anna, you are the child welfare reporter. So what are the biggest reoccurring issues that are facing Indigenous children today? I know it's a big question, but how do you hope the reporting that you're doing for Indiginews will kind of change the current discourse?
Well, I started the role by doing sort of a broad outreach, connecting with community, and really spoke with folks about what do you want to hear? Like, how do you want to be represented? Because Indigenous children and youth in care are often misrepresented or re-traumatized by the stories that are coming out about their experiences. And what I heard was that there needs to be a balance of the good work that's going on in community to support our children and youth in care, as well as some of the very real things that are impacting our families. So I know our children, Indigenous children and youth, are grossly represented in the child welfare system across Canada, and it's not getting any better. And it is really a very violent and hard and heartbreaking space. So even in my own practice as a writer and a storyteller, I've had to really check myself and have that balance of stories to remember the folks that are doing the good work, while also honoring the youth's experiences. So I think it's in BC, like 60% of children and youth in care are Indigenous. Indigenous children across the board are sort of represented in these like really, really hard places. And so, yeah, it just has to be a balance for me. For example, our Birth Alert series was, I know, really, really hard on our team, a very important story, but the stress that it caused us as a team.
Yeah. Could you expand on that? What was your Birth Alert thing?
Yeah. So my colleague Bailey filed an FOI and about birth alerts towards the end of 2020, and we received a package of information that revealed that British Columbia knew that the practice of birth alerts were illegal. The Attorney General had sent a memo to MCFD. And the practice of birth alerts continued on for a number of months after they were made aware that it is illegal. And of course, birth alerts are the removal of babies from their maternal, from their parents shortly after birth. And again, Indigenous babies were overrepresented in that space as well. So we did a series of stories when we came across that information. And just before Christmas, we got a letter from the Ministry of Attorney General requesting for the information back, which was stressful just before, Christmas. And breaking the story was really hard. And, the folks that have reached out to us that have actually experienced having a birth alert issued on them as a mother, it was just a very, very challenging space. So, I've had to shift and focus on some stories. I'm doing a 3-part series right now on cedar. And so I'm sort of finding the connections between how cedar as a medicine connects our youth, and how people are using that as an outlet to uplift our youth and connect them to our ways of knowing and our cultures.
That's and I think that ties in to the question I was going to ask Emily after that, is because there's always the chat about the gaps in Indigenous news and sort of the flaws on how it's being reported. The idea that that all the news about Indigenous situations are negative as opposed to positive. So you're taking an example here of a more positive outlook on some traditional medicines or whatnot. So Emily, can you tell me a bit about how do you feel about that, and what are you doing to address that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a constant striving for that balance between not shying away from the problems. Like, I think
that's true. Yeah,
we can't do everything, right? We're a small team, but I think we try and do our best to highlight some of the institutional, structural, colonial problems, like really highlight some of the corruption that's going on. Ideally, in a dream world, we'd be filing way more FOIs. I think if everybody was filing FOIs, we'd know way more.
Just to clarify for the listeners, FOI is?
Yeah, like an access to information request.
Okay,
so
yep.
Anybody really can file these access to information requests and ask for, I want to see government documents or memos between, different political bodies or government, bodies, and see kind of behind the scenes. You're not going to get all information, but you're going to get enough that sometimes you can start piecing together. And an investigative journalist is really good at that. But again, our thing is not like deep investigation. So we kind of do what we can, but I do think it's important to uncover the colonial issues and problems and injustices and inequities, to continue to educate this population in so-called Canada on, the reality of what's going on and ongoing relationships. But at the same time, we just had a really important conversation in our newsroom on Monday around energy. And it sounds, I don't mean it in like that kind of, white hippie way of like
in the holistic sense or anything. Yeah,
like we had like a pretty deep conversation. Like one of our reporters, Kelsey, had some teachings shared with her from a woman that she works with, talking about how, and we all know this, some people say, I don't read the news because it just depresses me, right? So she was talking about the energy that we're spreading in our work, and how we also have the responsibility to engage with stories that do make people feel uplifted and empowered and excited. So again, that's where I think representation really, really is so crucial and key, because when people see positive stories about people in their community or other youth or other elders or other people doing good work, I think we feel inspired, they feel inspired. I think it talks back to that ongoing racism that exists in this country. Of course, because of this very recent history of colonization, ongoing relationship of colonization. So again, when you look at the history of newspapers in Canada, Indigenous peoples were represented as what my grandmother was called growing up, savage, as uncivilized, as this and that. And then it can even flip and go to this over-romanticization, mystification of Indigenous peoples as well, which, colonization is inherently like dehumanizing. So I believe that in our work, we need to constantly be asking ourselves, what's our intention? And are we humanizing? Are we bringing the human, the spirit back to our stories? So like I said, you know, it is a balance. It's like really trying to do that and have these ongoing conversations in the newsrooms on how we can do that, how we check in on our intention. Because again, you're asked to submit all these stories all the time. You can't always stop and like have these philosophical conversations to be like, how can we best do that? But
Yeah.
we try and find that balance for sure.
Absolutely. And I think you've done a great job at doing that based off of what I've read. I'm like, I think there's this really nice flow of, you know, reporting on things that need to be said that are unfortunately can be considered bad news, and then also focusing on the positive at the same time. And I think Anna brought that up as a great example. So I think you guys are doing great.
Thanks. We got to get you a sweater or something.
Yeah, can I get a mug, sweater, hat, pen, anything? Yeah, I'll take it. I'll wear it, and then I'll do the next show with it. I got some more mugs coming in too. I gave like 22 away. I'll make sure I put some aside for you guys. Okay, so Anna, we're just going to wrap up the show here, but I kind of want to finish with you and ask, you know, a bit about your new educational journey. You know, you have quite a bit of education behind you already, and I heard you are going to be hopping into some law school. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to give it a try and
just give it a try. Just like, come on. It's not like a weekend course at a college.
Well, my colleague Katlia is in the UVic law program as well, and she really inspired me. You know, she's an author, she's a journalist, she's a mom, and she's in law school, and that's one of the things I really love about this group of people that I get to work with is we all really uplift each other, and was really inspired by Katlia as well as a number of other people that I know that are in the program. And it's just been a dream of mine. And through this work, really interfacing with the child welfare system really inspired me to want to continue learning and growing and to develop tools and skills to be on the forefront of some really great changes that are happening right now. Bill C-92, the act that is allowing First Nations to give notice to the federal government that they are going to be taking control of the child welfare, their child welfare legislation all across Turtle Island, or all across Canada rather. We have First Nations that are developing their own legislation and laws. So it's an incredibly exciting time, and I just want to be a part of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about, you know, harnessing your dream, which is, I think, highly important. I can relate to you 100% because like you probably noticed, I'm going to be going into journalism school for the next 2 years. So it's just one of those things where you just, again, with COVID, you just sit and you wonder and you start planning, like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? So congratulations on following your dream. I think it's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Advice from both of you before we go. You're both in journalism. You're both reporting. You're both putting in the work. You know, that's where I'm going as well too. Like I said, I'm going to be going to BCIT in Burnaby for the broadcasting journalism program while continuing the show is the plan. So some quick advice on what you can give me on some success in the field. We'll go Anna first.
I don't have a formal journalism background, so I've really leaned on the people around me to be mentoring me and teaching me. But one of the things that really has stuck with me is when I am interviewing somebody, I'm just completely opening myself up to be a conduit for stories. And I always let my interviewee know that I will be smudging and meditating on the story before I dive in. And that really allows me to connect with the spirit of the story. So that's something that I really enjoy doing in this work.
That's really cool. What about you, Emily? What do you got for me?
I would say step out of the wheelhouse, right? Like, especially the culture of journalism, we could just get so into it. I remember the culture in journalism school even. I would say, like, step out of it. If you want to be original, if you want to bring something original, if you want people to hire you because you're different than everybody else, then be different than everybody else, you know, like step out. Anna said, meditate, you know, follow your own practice of what that may be for you to stay connected and grounded. Because we really believe in some ways, like, we're vehicles for stories to speak through. So you have to organize your organism in certain ways in order to allow those stories to come through in a good way. So again, you know, your self-care practice, whatever you need to do to kind of step out and have those moments where you're realizing, like, this is the way that journalism's going. This is how I want to engage in it. This is what I can bring to the table. Really prioritize that time and space to do that.
Wow. Well, thank you to so much, Emily and Anna, for coming on the show and for the advice. I really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time. I know you guys rearranged your meeting this morning so you could be in the interview with me, so I greatly appreciate it. Emily and Anna from Indiginews, thank you so much for being on Our Native Land. I wish you the best of luck.